I never thought the sound of gravel crunching beneath tires could make my stomach twist, but that night it did. Headlights cut across my driveway, their white beams slicing through the darkness, and when I stepped out onto the porch, the cold air carried the bitter scent of exhaust. A black SUV idled at the curb, its engine low and growling, and standing in front of it was Mark Hensley, our 35-year-old HOA president. His suit jacket looked too sharp for a midnight meeting. His tie was loose, but the arrogance in his posture was iron tight. He wasn't alone. Two other men climbed out from the SUV, heavy boots thudding against the pavement. Their shadows stretched long across my lawn, covering the garden my late wife and I had planted together. That patch of soil, roses, lavender, a small wooden bench, was more than flowers. It was a memory. It was mine. Mark smiled without warmth. "Evening, Richard," he said, voice carrying like a prosecutor's. "You know why I'm here." I didn't. Or maybe I did and I didn't want to admit it. The HOA had been breathing down my neck for months. Letters about unauthorized fencing, fines for non-compliant lawn ornaments, all petty nonsense. But this was different. This was personal. "You can't keep this section," Mark continued, pointing to the edge of my property, where the gravel path ran along a row of old oak trees. "The board voted. That strip belongs to the association now." My chest tightened. That strip of land was the very boundary my father and I had marked when I was 17, hammering posts into the earth with blistered hands. My deeds showed it. My memories proved it. And now this man, half my age, thought he could erase it with a wave of his hand? I tried to keep my voice steady. "That land's mine. Been mine for 40 years. You can't just take it." Mark's smile widened, but his eyes turned cold. "Richard, you've always been difficult. But difficult people don't last long in communities like ours. You'll hand it over, or you'll regret it." The other two men stepped closer, boots sinking into my lawn, and the night air seemed to thicken. I could smell the faint reek of cigarettes on their jackets. One cracked his knuckles, the other kept glancing at the SUV, as if waiting for an order. I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs. My hands itched to reach for the phone in my pocket, to call the sheriff, but I knew what would happen. Mark would spin the story, turn the board against me, maybe even pull strings with the county. He had influence, money, and the blind loyalty of half the neighborhood. Still, I forced myself to stand my ground. "You don't scare me." For a moment, silence hung between us, heavy as a storm cloud. Then Mark leaned in, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Sharp, chemical, suffocating. "You will," he whispered. "By the end of this week, that land won't just be gone. You'll wish you'd never fought me at all." He straightened, turned on his heel, and snapped his fingers. The two men followed him back to the SUV, boots thudding, gravel crunching, headlights flaring brighter. As the vehicle pulled away, its taillights glowing like angry eyes in the dark, I was left standing barefoot on the porch, heart pounding, the smell of exhaust fading into the night. I stared at the oaks, at the strip of land they wanted, at the place my father and I had worked with our hands and sweat to claim as ours. My fists clenched. What did Mark mean by the end of this week? What was he planning? And how far was he willing to go to strip me of the only piece of ground that still tied me to my family's name? My name is Richard Palmer. I'm 62 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you worked hard, kept your head down, and treated your neighbors with respect, you'd be left in peace. I was wrong. I live in a modest two-story farmhouse tucked at the end of Sycamore Lane, just outside the city. It's not fancy. White siding faded by sun, a tin roof that rattles in thunderstorms, and a wraparound porch that creaks under its own weight. But it's mine. My father built it with his own hands back in the late 70s, and when he passed, it became my inheritance. For years, my wife Martha and I raised our children here. The backyard once rang with the sound of their laughter, their bare feet kicking through the grass. The smell of her peach cobbler used to drift out the kitchen window in summer, mingling with the honeysuckle from the garden. Martha's been gone for 6 years now. Cancer. Some days the house feels too big, too empty. But the land is what keeps me rooted. There's something about walking the property line in the morning, dew soaking my boots, birdsong echoing from the oaks. Every fence post I drive into the ground feels like a conversation with my father. Every flower bed a memory of Martha's gentle hands. This land isn't just dirt. It's history, dignity, the only constant I have left. When the neighborhood association first formed, I didn't think much of it. A handful of newer residents decided to formalize things, make rules about trash pickup and lawn care. I signed the charter, figuring it couldn't hurt. But that's where Mark Hensley comes in. Mark moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago. Tall, athletic build, perfect hair, and the kind of smug grin you'd expect from someone who's never had a callus on his hand. He introduced himself as a real estate investor, which I later learned meant he bought distressed properties, slapped on cosmetic upgrades, and sold them for profit. Nothing illegal, but nothing honorable either. He loved to brag about how he was the youngest HOA president in county history. 35 years old, and already he walked like he owned everything he looked at. At first, I tried to stay polite, but Mark wasn't just interested in enforcing bylaws. He was interested in power, and I was his favorite target. It started small. One morning, I found a letter taped to my mailbox. "Violation notice," the bold heading declared. Apparently, the small wooden cross Martha had placed by the roses, a tribute to her faith, was deemed an unapproved lawn ornament. I was ordered to remove it within 7 days or face a $50 fine. I thought it was some kind of clerical mistake. I called Mark, told him what the cross meant, how it wasn't gaudy or offensive. He chuckled, said rules were rules, and hung up. I left the cross. A week later, another letter arrived, this time with the fine attached. Then came the fencing dispute. My property line runs along a gravel path shaded by the oaks, the same strip Mark claimed belonged to the association. He filed a complaint saying my old wooden posts were encroaching on communal land. I dug out the original deed, stamped and notarized, proving otherwise. But Mark dismissed it, saying the HOA survey overruled my outdated paperwork. It wasn't just me either. My neighbor, Carol, a widowed school teacher in her 60s, was cited for her non-standard shutters. Shutters her husband had built decades ago. Another neighbor was fined for parking his RV in his own driveway. But when Mark's friends threw late-night parties, cars spilling onto the street, the HOA looked the other way. I noticed a pattern. Mark wasn't applying rules. He was weaponizing them. And for some reason, he had his sights locked on me. The first board meeting I attended under his presidency felt like stepping into a courtroom where the verdict was already written. Mark sat at the head table, gavel in hand, smirk plastered on his face. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he read off violations in a tone meant to humiliate. When I tried to speak up, he cut me off, banging the gavel so hard the echo made my teeth ache. "Mr. Palmer," he said, eyes gleaming, "this community requires compliance. If you can't respect the association's authority, perhaps this neighborhood isn't the right fit for you." The room was filled with neighbors, some shifting uncomfortably in their folding chairs, others avoiding eye contact. I could see sympathy in a few faces. Carol's lips pressed into a thin line, another neighbor's hands twisting nervously in his lap. But no one spoke. Mark had made them afraid. He thrived on that fear. I left the meeting with a sour taste in my mouth and a sinking feeling in my chest. The first skirmish had been fought, and though I still held my land, I knew Mark wasn't finished. That night I sat alone on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee, listening to the cicadas drone in the distance. The stars blinked cold and steady overhead, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. The sense that a storm was gathering, and no matter how hard I braced myself, it was coming for me. Because Mark wasn't just an ambitious young man playing at leadership. He was entitled, he was manipulative, and he was just getting started. The week after that board meeting, the notices started arriving like clockwork. First, it was a $75 fine for excessive grass height. I measured it myself, 3.5 inches. The rule said 4 was the maximum. I called Mark. He didn't answer. Then it was a $200 penalty for unapproved exterior paint. My house hadn't been painted in over a decade, the same faded white it had always been. When I asked for clarification, The letter arrived back stamped with Mark's signature. Your siding shows discoloration inconsistent with neighborhood standards. By the third letter, a citation about my unsightly tool shed, I stopped bothering to argue. I knew what this was. It wasn't about the grass, or the paint, or the shed. It was about pressure, squeeze me until I break. Every envelope I opened carried the sharp chemical tang of printer ink and the weight of Mark's smirk, even when he wasn't standing there. I started waking at night to the sound of paper sliding through my mail slot, only to find nothing there. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or if Mark was planting seeds of paranoia. The neighbors noticed. Some of them whispered to me in passing. Carol pressed her lips together one morning as we met at the mailbox. "You're not alone, Richard," she said softly. "He's been on me, too. He fined me for my clothesline, said it was unsightly. But when I asked if she'd speak up at the next meeting, she shook her head. I can't. I live off my pension. If he starts piling fines on me, I'll lose my house." Fear. That was Mark's weapon. Fear kept good people silent. 2 weeks later, I came home from the grocery store to find neon orange stakes hammered into my yard. They ran in a crooked line across the edge of my property, slicing through the rose garden Martha had planted. The sight hit me like a punch to the gut. I followed the stakes, heart pounding, until I spotted a man in a reflective vest, folding up a surveyor's tripod. "Hey," I called. "What do you think you're doing?" He looked startled, but not guilty, just indifferent. "Survey for the HOA. They requested a boundary reassessment." "Without my permission?" He shrugged. "HOA's got authority." He loaded his equipment into a pickup and drove off, dust spitting from his tires. That night, Mark's SUV idled in front of my driveway again. He didn't get out this time, just sat there, headlights glaring, before rolling away. A message clear as day. I control the lines now. I decided to push back, filing an official complaint with the county clerk, attaching copies of my deed, Martha's will, everything that proved ownership. I even mailed a copy directly to Mark, certified. A week later, I found my mailbox smashed in. The wooden post split clean through, the box dented like it had been hit with a baseball bat. No note, no witnesses, just destruction. When I called the sheriff, he sighed. "Richard, without proof it was him, there's not much we can do." You know how these HOA disputes get. Messy, petty. Courts don't like getting involved. I hung up feeling smaller than I'd ever felt. That was Mark's brilliance. He pushed just far enough that it felt personal, but not far enough for the law to care. The next HOA meeting was worse. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, neighbors sat in their metal chairs, and Mark strutted to the podium with the gavel in hand like it was a scepter. He called the meeting to order, then immediately launched into my supposed violations. His voice boomed. "Richard Palmer continues to demonstrate contempt for this community's rules. Non-compliant structures, unauthorized religious symbols, aggressive behavior toward board-appointed contractors." My fists clenched. "That's a lie," I barked, standing. "You sent that surveyor without my consent. You're trespassing on my property." Mark smirked, eyes glittering. "Mr. Palmer, your temper is precisely why this board must take action. If you cannot abide by our decisions, you may face legal removal from the neighborhood." Gasps rippled through the room. Removal? He was threatening to take my home. I looked around at the faces. Carol's pale, lips trembling. Young couples avoiding my gaze. An older man staring down at his shoes. No one spoke. Not one person defended me. The gavel slammed. Fines will continue until compliance is achieved. I left that meeting with my ears burning and my heart hammering. Over the next month, the pressure intensified. Trash pickup citation. I set my bins out the same as always, but received a $50 fine for placement outside designated hours. Noise complaint. Mark claimed I was using power tools at night. Absurd, since I rarely touch them after dusk. Lien notice. The real hammer dropped in the mail one morning. A letter stating that unpaid fines could result in a lien on my property. My property. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper as the morning sun slanted through the blinds. My coffee had gone cold, untouched. My father's words echoed in my head. Land is the only thing they're not making more of. Protect it. But how do you fight a man who twists every rule, every letter of the law, into a weapon? The intimidation didn't stop with paper. Some mornings I found tire tracks cutting across the edge of my yard. Once I woke to the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel outside, but when I swung the porch light on, no one was there. I noticed cars slowing down when they passed my house, windows rolled down, faces hidden in shadow. Was it Mark's men, or just neighbors curious about the drama? I couldn't tell anymore. Every creak of the floorboards at night set my nerves on edge. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. One evening, Carol knocked softly on my door. She stood clutching a casserole dish, eyes darting nervously toward the street. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, stepping inside. "But I need you to know, people see what he's doing. They're just scared." "Scared of what?" I asked. "It's just fines. Letters." She shook her head. "It's more than that. Last month, Jim down the street challenged him about the party noise. 2 days later, his car was keyed. Another neighbor tried to petition about the dues increase, and suddenly his insurance rates doubled. Mark's brother works at the agency. He finds ways, Richard. He always finds ways." Her words chilled me more than the fines. Mark wasn't just a bully with a clipboard. He was weaving a net of influence, stretching into every corner of our lives. By late autumn, my savings were dwindling from fines I refused to pay. Every letter stacked higher on the kitchen counter, a leaning tower of intimidation. My blood pressure climbed. My doctor warned me to manage stress. But how do you manage stress when your very home is under siege? I started documenting everything. Dates, letters, photographs of damage. A binder grew thicker by the week. If Mark thought he could bury me in paper, I'd bury him in evidence. Still, doubt gnawed at me in the quiet hours. Could one man fight an entire board, especially one led by someone as ruthless as Mark Hensley? And then came the night that changed everything. The night the intimidation turned criminal. The night the intimidation turned criminal began with a sound I couldn't mistake. The snap of wood splintering. I jolted awake, heart racing, the taste of copper sharp in my mouth. The bedside clock read 1:17 a.m. The air outside was still, the kind of heavy silence that makes even the crickets hold their breath. Then came another sound, the groan of metal scraping, followed by muffled voices. I grabbed the flashlight and shotgun I kept by the bed, though I prayed I wouldn't need the latter. The porch boards groaned under my bare feet as I eased outside. The beam of light cut across the yard, sweeping over the rose garden, the oaks, the gravel path, until it froze on the sight that twisted my stomach into knots. 2 men in hooded sweatshirts were yanking at the boundary fence, wrenching the posts from the earth. Splinters flew as one of them heaved, sending the wooden stake crashing into the dirt. And behind them, standing with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face, was Mark Hensley. The audacity of it nearly stunned me silent. He hadn't even bothered to hide. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" My voice cracked the silence like a rifle shot. Mark turned, his teeth gleaming under the moonlight. "Correcting a mistake," he said coolly. "This land belongs to the association. I'm just making it official." The men kept working, boots digging furrows into my soil, ignoring me like I was nothing more than background noise. I raised the shotgun, not aiming at anyone, just high enough that the gesture carried weight. "Get off my land." One of the men froze, glancing at Mark. The other shifted uneasily, but Mark didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "You won't pull that trigger, Richard. You're an old man clinging to the past. The sheriff won't side with you, and the court will bury you in fees. You're done." For a moment, the only sound was my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I lowered the barrel, forcing myself to think, not act on rage. "You just made a mistake, Mark," I said. "A big one." I swung the flashlight beam to the corner of the porch, where the small red light of a trail camera blinked steadily. Another one was mounted on the oak tree, hidden in shadow. They'd caught everything: the trespassing, the destruction, the smirk on his arrogant face. Mark's expression faltered, just for a second. Then the mask returned. That footage won't matter. By the time anyone sees it, your property will be under a lien. You'll be bankrupt. But the crack in his voice betrayed him. He knew he'd been caught. The next morning, I drove straight to the sheriff's office with the footage. My binder of letters, fines, and photographs weighed heavily in my arms. The deputy watched the video twice, jaw tightening with every frame. "This is clear trespass," he said, "and vandalism. We can't ignore this." For the first time in months, a flicker of hope sparked inside me. But I knew it wasn't enough. If I wanted to stop Mark for good, I needed to expose him publicly, in front of the very people he'd been intimidating. And the perfect chance came a week later, the quarterly HOA board meeting, the one where dues were being raised again. Everyone would be there. The clubhouse smelled of old coffee and disinfectant, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry bees. Folding chairs lined the room, everyone filled. Neighbors whispered, clutching papers, eyes darting nervously toward the podium where Mark stood with his gavel. He looked calm, too calm. Dressed in a dark suit, hair slicked back, he radiated confidence. He knew the routine: intimidate, announce, dismiss. He'd done it a dozen times before. I sat in the front row, binder on my lap, the weight of the trail camera's SD card burning like a coal in my pocket. Mark rapped the gavel. "Order. Tonight we'll be discussing dues increases and ongoing violations. Let's begin with..." "Before you begin," I said, rising to my feet, "I have evidence of criminal activity by this board's president." A ripple ran through the crowd. Heads turned. Mark's smirk tightened, but he leaned casually on the podium. "Mr. Palmer, this is not the time for personal grievances." "Oh, it's not personal," I shot back, pulling a small portable projector from my bag. My fingers shook, but my voice held steady. "It's business. The business of trespass, destruction, abuse of power." The deputy I'd spoken to had agreed to attend, sitting quietly in the back of the room. When I nodded to him, he gave the faintest tilt of his chin. The projector hummed to life, casting shaky footage onto the white wall. Gasps echoed as the images appeared. Mark, standing in my yard under moonlight, watching as his men ripped up my fence. His voice clear as day. "This land belongs to the association. I'm just making it official." The room erupted. Neighbors leaned forward whispering, some with hands pressed to their mouths. Carol's eyes glistened with relief. Mark's face drained of color. This is out of context," he stammered. "That footage is doctored. Palmer's manipulating you." The deputy stood, his badge catching the light. "It's admissible evidence. Mr. Hensley, you'll need to come with me." Silence dropped like a hammer. The gavel slipped from Mark's hand, clattering against the podium. For once, he didn't look powerful. He looked small. As the deputy cuffed him, murmurs turned into cheers. Neighbors who had been silent for months finally found their voices, clapping, nodding, whispering words like, "about time," and "justice." Mark twisted, eyes locking on mine, filled with venom. "This isn't over," he hissed. But it was. Everyone in that room knew it. The SUV that once idled outside my house now sat impounded. The men who tore down my fence vanished from the neighborhood overnight, and the HOA board, stripped of its leader, scrambled like ants from a kicked mound. For the first time in months, I slept soundly. The house creaked in the night, but the sound no longer filled me with dread. It was just wood and wind, not footsteps in the dark. The days after Mark's arrest felt unreal. For months, I had lived under the weight of his shadow. The fines, the threats, the constant gnawing fear that I'd lose my land. And then, almost overnight, that shadow was gone. I woke up the next morning and stepped onto the porch. The air was crisp, cool with the bite of early winter. The oaks stood tall, leaves rattling in the breeze, and for the first time in a long while, they didn't feel like witnesses to a crime scene. They felt like guardians again. The roses, battered but still clinging to life, seemed brighter in the morning sun. The mailbox was replaced, brand new and sturdy, courtesy of neighbors who showed up quietly that weekend with tools and lumber. Carol stood beside me, hammer in hand, her smile soft but proud. "You stood up when the rest of us couldn't," she said. "Now it's our turn to help you." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear those words until my throat tightened and I had to look away. At the next HOA meeting, the first without Mark at the podium, the atmosphere was completely different. No smirks, no gavel slamming like a weapon. The interim chair, a soft-spoken retired librarian, began the session with an apology. On behalf of the board, we acknowledge the harm caused under Mr. Hensley's leadership. The abuse of power, the intimidation, it stops here. Neighbors who had once avoided my gaze now approached me openly. Jim, whose car had been keyed, clapped me on the shoulder. A young couple down the street who had kept their shutters closed during the worst of it invited me for dinner. Even those who had stayed silent out of fear admitted their regret, their shame. It was bittersweet. I understood their silence. Fear can choke even the strongest voices. But seeing them find their courage again made me realize something. Mark hadn't just tried to take my land. He tried to take our community's spirit. And by standing up, I hadn't just saved a boundary line. I'd lit a fire. News travels fast in small towns. Within days, local papers ran headlines. HOA, president arrested for trespass, vandalism. His mugshot circulated online. That smug grin wiped clean, replaced with pale, stunned disbelief. I heard he lost his investor clients, that banks pulled out of his deals, that his family left town in embarrassment. Whether he served time or not didn't matter as much as this. His power was gone. The arrogance that once filled every room had evaporated. And the men who followed him that night, they vanished, their loyalty worth less than the trouble it brought. For me, justice wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. My land remained mine. My father's post stood firm again, hammered back into place with my own two hands. Still, I won't pretend it didn't take a toll. I lost months of peace. I lost sleep, weight, and a few more lines etched into my face. There were nights when the house felt more prison than home, but every fight has its cost. And when I sat on the porch with Carol one evening, sipping coffee as the sun dipped low, I realized something Martha once told me had proven true. The things worth keeping are the ones worth fighting for. The land wasn't just dirt and fence posts. It was a legacy. It was my wife's roses, my father's sweat, my children's laughter echoing across the yard. It was proof that some things cannot be bullied away, no matter how loud the gavel or how deep the pockets. When neighbors now ask me how I stood it, how I kept fighting when it seemed hopeless, I tell them the truth. I didn't always believe I'd win. There were nights I thought about selling, leaving it all behind. But every time I reached that point, I thought of Martha's garden, my father's hands, the roots sunk deep into the soil, and I thought, if I walk away, then he wins not just over me, but over everyone else he'll bully next. Standing up wasn't just about my property. It was about dignity, about freedom, about telling men like Mark Hensley that power has limits, and those limits are drawn by the courage of ordinary people. Tonight, as I sit on the porch, the stars above are sharp and clear, and the land feels quiet again. No SUVs idling at the curb, no letters in the mailbox filled with threats. Just the creak of the rocking chair, the smell of lavender drifting from the garden, the memory of Martha's voice soft as a hymn. I know battles like this will happen again, in other neighborhoods with other names. There will always be people like Mark, entitled, arrogant, hungry for control. But there will also always be people like us. People who stand, even when standing means standing alone. And maybe that's the point. That's how communities are truly built. Not by fear, not by rules twisted into weapons, but by courage stitched together in the quiet hearts of neighbors who decide enough is enough. I look at the oaks swing in the night breeze, their roots deep, their branches strong, and I realize I've weathered the storm. Justice was served, and my dignity, like this land, remains mine. This wasn't just a fight over fence posts or roses. It was a fight over principle, over the idea that power unchecked can strip you of more than property. It can strip you of your peace, your pride, your very identity, but only if you let it, and I didn't. I